Welcome to this next edition of our In Conversation series, where we've been exploring various aspects of collective worship within Church of England schools. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome this morning Gill Hipwell. And Gill, thank you so much for joining.
Oh, it's lovely to be with you, and thank you for inviting me.
Oh, an absolute pleasure. Would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are and your background.
Thank you. Well, I'm fortunate to live on the Norfolk-Suffolk border in the lovely Waveney Valley. And for 25 years, I was a teacher, mainly, but not totally, in secondary schools. And then I left that job to become an advisor for the Diocese of Norwich, which I did for 7 years. And I've been a SIAS and then SIAMS inspector for 15 years. I started that probably, I think, in the second year of when church inspections really started to ramp up. And then I became a critical reader and a regional trainer. The reason I left teaching was not because I didn't love it, I did, but I increasingly felt that there was something else that I could be doing to help people who were themselves teaching, because teachers were increasingly under pressure, a huge workload, but also inspection from outside, lots of people coming in and looking at what they were doing. And it was spoiling things for teachers. The pressure of somebody coming in and criticising what they were doing without, as teachers thought, necessarily really understanding why they were doing it became an issue for me, and I wanted to help with that. I've been really fortunate that I've worked with some absolutely fantastic people who have shared their wisdom with me, taught me a lot, and also taught me a lot about how you can achieve more through collaboration.
That's amazing, Jill. Thank you. And I'm thrilled to have you, because I know you come here with so much wisdom and experience from what you've seen and what you've led, and what you've learned through your time looking at collective worship. So our topic for this In Conversation with is all about what I kind of call the kind of connecting the jigsaw. So how can we have a coherent weekly program of collective worship where we move from Monday to Tuesday, which builds on what's going to come next on Wednesday, which inspires Thursday and Friday's collective worship. And I know many schools have thought about this process quite carefully, and they absolutely love what they do. But I know that many schools at the moment, particularly when we're thinking of coming back, potentially in March, of perhaps taking a chance to refresh the routines. So I wonder, for schools that want to explore collective worship provision each week and get that thread Monday through to Friday, from your perspective, where should they start? Where's a good place to begin?
Okay, so I really am pleased that you've talked about this thread from Monday to Friday, because the first thing I would want to say is I have seen hundreds of acts of collective worship, and it's very rare for me to see one that's not good in some way. I think there's a lot of really good collective worship going on in schools, but it's also quite rare for me to see a school, either myself or through reading a report on a school, where collective worship is truly a shared endeavour across all the staff in the school, across, let's say, a half term. And I think that is a really good place to start, is looking at what is your vision for collective worship? Why are you doing it? It's not a lesson, but if you were thinking about another subject in school, you wouldn't dream of just letting everybody get on with their own thing without looking at what everybody else was doing and how that fitted into an overall pattern. So I think the first thing is, well, what's your vision for collective worship? What are your aims? What do you want to get out of it? Not an act of worship, but holistically, collective worship. I do think that sometimes people break collective worship down into this 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes in a day as one entity. Whereas, and I will say now, speaking as an inspector, we look at collective worship much more holistically than that. In fact, inspectors are now told it is not necessary to watch an act of collective worship in a school in order to inspect and make a judgment on the quality of collective worship, because the understanding is that this is about the whole thing. Do people understand why we're having collective worship in school? What's it for? What's the purpose of collective worship for our school in our context? And how can we make that work for us? So
that's so important, isn't it? That sense of the why, and particularly when we're thinking more and more in Church of England schools about that vision, and then thinking, well, how is collective worship an expression of our vision? Again, it keeps coming back to that why, and it keeps coming back to that shared understanding that it's not just in one person's head what collective worship is. It's something that everyone buys into and they know and they understand.
I sometimes think that the understanding of collective worship is like a cupcake with a cherry on the top. And some people say, oh, collective worship, that's like the cherry on the top of our cake. Well, if you are saying that you have a cake and it's a lovely cake, and to really pull it all together and to make it perfect, you put your cherry on the top, then brilliant. But if it becomes all about the cherry and the cake will be just as good without it, then that's not quite the same thing, because the cherry can be lovely. But if you stick it on top of a cake it doesn't match up with, then it's not really here nor there. You're making it two separate things.
Yeah.
So collective worship should not be something that happens and then we forget about it until we have the next one the next day. Collective worship really should be the Kickstarter of what's happening in school, because this is our opportunity to explore what we're about. Collective worship is all about reflection. So it's all about exploration. It's about exploration of what we believe, why we believe it. But more importantly, even for schools, it's about how we incorporate that into our life in school. It's the difference between a school having a set of rules that are there to moderate pupil behaviour, or a school having values which are there for everybody. And yes, they do moderate pupils' behaviour and they do guide how we go, but they're not just for in the classroom or just for at school. They're about something inside ourselves and something about us as a community that is for all the time. And collective worship is the core of that, somewhere you can explore it and really look at what is it that we want and how are we going to express that and how are we going to make it relevant to the way that we live.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Jill. I think there's some really important points there, and it certainly drew attention to me where quite often collective worship is spoken about as the heartbeat of the school, where we come together as community and then it pumps life out into all aspects. So once a school has taken that initial step in exploring the why of collective worship, what next?
Okay.
What is the next best step?
Yeah. So great. You've got together and you've discussed what do we want from worship? What does it mean? What's it going to do for us as a school? But then it comes down to the nitty gritty, doesn't it? Monday to Friday, we're delivering collective worship. How are we going to do that? And I think teachers have got this huge wisdom about how to work with children. And you need to utilize that as part of collective worship. It's not, the approach might be slightly different in that you're not strictly speaking teaching, but you're still interacting with children and other adults, and you're still wanting them to gain an understanding. You want them to enjoy it. You want them to engage. And teachers have got loads and loads of skills and experience. So first of all, think about how can you have something that is the same but different? It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But teachers do it all the time. They teach to a curriculum, but you go into two classrooms and you would expect to see different things. And collective worship is like that. The pot might be the same shape, but the contents of the pot will be perhaps different, using people's strengths. So it mixes familiar and new, using teaching strategies in collective worship. So each person should be delivering in a style that is comfortable for them, but also plays to their strengths. So there is room in collective worship for the extrovert dramatist who strides about the stage, as it were, encouraging a sort of a noisy response, and the person who plays quiet music, looks at a picture, speaks very quietly, spends a lot of time in reflection. If you put that, all of it can have a shared structure. A structure that lots of schools which reflects the Church of England structure, is a gathering, engaging, responding, and sending. But there's a huge range of things that you can do within that structure. The structure remains familiar. How you interpret that structure can be very different depending on the person who is delivering or the purpose of what you want to achieve from the collective worship. The other thing I would look at is, as well as the gather, engage, respond, and send, is space. How do you make sure that what you are doing is providing a space that says, now this is collective worship? Because school halls usually smell of cabbage, don't they? That's the place you go to do PE. It's where you might have your lunch. It's where there might be before and after school club. But if you're also using that for an act of collective worship, then it needs to look and feel a bit different. There needs to be something that says, now this is collective worship. Exactly the same in the classroom. So attending to the space. It needs to be distinctive, it needs to be special, and it needs to be recognizable. So the place where we worship and the worship that we experience should always be all of those things. With my inspector hat on, and because I do think that schools need to know what an inspector might ask any teacher or member of support staff or child when they're in school, I would say, be sure that you know what makes the place you worship and the worship that you're providing distinctive, special, and recognizable. And then the second thing I would ask as an inspector is, how much reflection is there in your collective worship? And are you inviting children and adults to reflect, or are you telling them what to think about? Because those are not the same thing. So inviting people to reflect on a message is not the same as telling them what you think the message means and asking them to think about it. So those two things are really very important for each act of worship.
Thanks, John. I think that's so important. I think even just having that in your mind, we've got an act of collective worship each day. Let's keep that same structure, one that's shared. So you're thinking about space and place, you're thinking about gathering, engaging, reflecting, and then sending. Yeah. And then, playing to people's strengths, as you said, thinking back to my own school context, I was absolutely terrified if I had to stand in front of a key stage and try to facilitate worship. But put me in front of a class where it's a little bit more reflective, I suppose thinking back, that was more reflective of my own spirituality, then, that was great. So play to people's strengths. So keeping that in mind, that kind of same but different, but having that shared framework, that core structure, what would your advice be regarding then weekly collective worship, that Monday through to Friday?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the first thing is there is no one size fits all. So it needs to be something that is appropriate for the school. But what I would say is a really good practice is not to look at Monday's collective worship, Tuesday's collective worship, Wednesday's collective worship, but to say, let's look at the whole week and let's have a look at what might go in there to make really good collective worship over a whole week that we can do with the people who are delivering. So for example, and this is only an example, you might have a very good relationship with your church, and your church might be happy to come in and take collective worship once a week. And you might say, right, so every week the church is going to come in, they're going to do collective worship, and that is going to be focused on a Bible story, and that is going to be the main part of their collective worship. That's what they've decided they're doing. Might be through Open the Book, might be through reading a Bible story, might be through a dramatic retelling of a story. Anyway, but that's what the church is going to do, and they will decide how they'll do it. And that's going to be, let's say, for the sake of argument, on a Monday. They're going to prepare that. So that once that act of collective worship has happened, that becomes a resource for the person who's delivering the worship on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, because that story and the messages from that story are already there. So another collective worship in the week might be Tuesday, might be Wednesday. Somebody on the staff might build on that. So they might do it by quickly reminding the children of the story and then picking out a particular aspect of it that they want everybody to reflect on. Not spending a lot of time retelling the story, not spending a lot of time on input, but more time on reflection. Teachers often think that that's a cop-out. They think, oh, but that doesn't take very much preparation. I shouldn't do that. Rubbish. Just because something's only taken you 5 minutes to prepare does not make it less good, because you join your preparation time to the preparation time of the person who did the other collective worship. There'll be some people like me. I prepare collective worship for my primary school. I've got lots more time to do it than the teacher. I am happy to spend a bit more time so that somebody else can make a connection to what I've done and get really good collective worship out of it, but without having to spend hours preparing it and in a way and a style that fits them. Another person in the same week might find a storybook or a story from another culture that has the same messages. They might read that or tell that and then compare that to a previous collective worship again. So what we're doing is we're using each other as a resource, as a bank of information, and building on this instead of starting at the beginning each time and thinking that we have to do everything in one act of collective worship. So over a whole week, you might have an act of collective worship that's mostly Bible story and a little bit of reflection. You might have a collective worship that is another story which compares the two and enables everybody to think about, well, how is that Bible story relevant to my life? You might have a collective worship which is almost all reflection based on worship that's gone before. You might have class worship, which is all about how children in the class have responded to what they've heard during the week, or for older children, it might be something that they think is relevant, that they've seen in the news, that everyone's going to talk about. And then you might, and I think we're going to come to this later, have some kind of whole school celebration where we look at how well people have done in their work or what they've been studying or whatever all week. Or you might have singing. And in that singing collective worship, you'd think about what we're learning, how might that song that we're learning relate to other acts of collective worship last week or this week, and how are we going to pull out those phrases? How are we going to make that part of the understanding? So what we get is not each person reinventing the wheel, but everybody looking at everything over the whole week and knowing. The key is that there is going to be somebody delivering a Bible story. You know that there's going to be somebody following up with that, doing reflection. You know that there's going to be a story, a secular story or a story from another culture that's going to put it into a more modern context or make people think more deeply. You know that's going to happen. You don't know exactly what they're going to say, but you know that's not your responsibility. So you know, I don't have to go through the whole Bible story because somebody's already done that. And as a teacher, you free yourself from the guilt of not spending hours developing a collective worship that probably, if I was an inspector and I came in and watched, happens all the time, watch a collective worship where people feel under pressure that they've got to provide everything, it's too long, too complicated, and actually that preparation could have lasted a whole week or 5 lots of your collective worship over 5 different weeks. It releases the stress and actually it makes better collective worship. You would not dream of teaching your maths lessons by starting from the beginning a new topic every time. You build on what children already have. You start with something that is familiar to them and then you give them something new or you give them another angle to look at. This is not different. It's just that you're not responsible for every bit of it. Other people are responsible too, and you share that. And at the end of the week, you look back on it and you think, wow, didn't we do a great job between us? You do not think, I didn't spend as long preparing mine as so-and-so did, or, I wish I could do the drama like that person, because that is completely counterproductive. And actually, you get better worship if you focus on the whole thing rather than just your bit.
No, I really love that, Jill. Thank you. And it made me certainly think again about that kind of connecting the jigsaw, that if you know the shape and structure of each worship, it's almost like that individual jigsaw piece. And if you know what your jigsaw piece is, you don't necessarily need to be overly concerned with the other ones because you're not planning those necessarily. You know what the big picture is, but you know your piece, you know the place of your piece, and you know how it connects to the other pieces. And I think it's so important that keep it simple. Keep it simple. You know your piece in the jigsaw, the worship that you might be facilitating. You know the shape, you know the structure. It doesn't have to be bells and whistles. Sometimes the most impactful, amazing collective worship is 5, 6, 7 minutes. And, you and I were both reflecting kind of as we met prior to this session that sometimes if we watch collective worship, it's way too long. You're kind of looking 20, 25 minutes, all bells and whistles, it's flags. And it's like, sometimes it's just keep it simple. Well, thank you ever so much, Jill. We've just covered so much ground thinking about, coherence Monday to Friday, keeping things the same but different, thinking about what's your jigsaw piece and all the other wisdom which you've shared. So can I really just take a moment to really thank you? We're so grateful for you giving your time and contributing to this series and for sharing your wisdom and your expertise. So thank you ever so much.
Absolute pleasure.